She was 12 years old and they called her a thief. She stood at the edge of the cleared land where the last of the settlement's muddy path dissolved into pine needles and shadow. The canvas sack hung from her right shoulder, heavier than it looked, lighter than it should have been. Behind her, the 12 cabins of Harrow's Bend sat low against the gray October sky, like stones half buried in earth. Smoke lifted from their chimneys in thin, pale columns. The smell of other people's fires. Other people's warmth. She did not look back. She walked forward into the trees and the forest closed around her the way water closes over a dropped stone. Quietly. Completely. As if she had never been standing in the light at all. That is where this story begins. But to understand what happened in those woods, and what she found there, and what it cost her, and what it gave her, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the walk, but the beginning of the girl. Because Willa Reed was not the kind of child who appeared out of nowhere. She was the kind of child who had been there all along, unseen, misread, quietly storing up everything the world was too distracted to notice. Harrow's Bend, Minnesota, October 1847. It was a settlement in the truest sense of the word, a place where people had not so much chosen to live as had stopped moving and decided that this would do. 12 cabins, a trading shed that doubled as a gathering place, a well and a stretch of cleared land that the men of the settlement had hacked out of the old forest with axes and anger and the particular stubbornness of people who had come too far to turn around. The nearest town of any size was 3 days' travel south. The nearest neighbor outside the settlement was farther than that. In October, when the sky began to lower and the first hard frost silvered the grass at dawn, Harrow's Bend felt like the last place on earth. Not the last in any romantic sense, the last in the sense of a candle burning down to its final inch. The people who lived there were practical above everything else. Sentiment was a luxury that the Northern Territories did not permit. A child's value was measured in the work their hands could do, the weight they could carry, the logs they could split, the rows they could tend. Children who could not be easily categorized by these measures were looked at sideways. They were not trusted. The people of Harrow's Bend did not hate what they did not understand, but they did not welcome it either. They moved around it the way you move around a piece of furniture placed in an inconvenient spot. Careful, watchful, waiting to see if it would eventually prove useful or if it would simply need to be removed. Willa Reed had been moved around her whole life. She was small for 12, with a slight frame that her father looked at the way a man looks at a tool that might snap under pressure. Her eyes were the particular shade of gray that made people uneasy without being able to explain why. They were too still, too attentive. The eyes of someone who watched and remembered and said nothing, which is a quality that most people find unsettling in a child and outright threatening in a woman. She had dark hair, cut bluntly at the jaw because her mother had neither the patience nor the time for anything more complicated. Her hands were calloused far beyond what her size suggested. Capable hands, quiet hands, the hands of a person who had learned that doing was safer than speaking. Her father, Harlan Reed, was the kind of man who had once been something more and had worn down into something less. There had been ambition in him, once the ambition that brought him north from Ohio in the first place, the belief that a man with enough will could stake out a life in the raw country and make it mean something. That ambition had not been defeated so much as it had been eroded year by year by the particular grinding patience of a land that did not care about a man's intentions. What remained of Harlan Reed was a man of few words and absolute judgments. He did not deliberate. He decided. Once decided, he did not revisit. He was not cruel by nature, but he had arrived at a place in his life where cruelty and certainty looked nearly identical, and he had stopped trying to tell the difference. He was also a man with a secret. Every settlement has its secrets, and Harlan Reed's was the kind that tends to find its way out at the worst possible moment, the way pressure always finds the weakest seam. Edith Reed, Willa's mother, had once been a woman of genuine warmth. You could still see traces of it in the way her face arranged itself when something surprised her, a brief softening, before the habitual exhaustion reasserted itself. She had come to Harrow's Bend as a young bride, full of the ordinary hopes of young brides, and the years had taken most of them. What she held on to literally and with both hands was a locket. Small oval gold, engraved on the face with a cluster of violets so fine that they seemed to have grown there rather than been carved. It had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that, and Edith wore it every day of her life against the skin of her throat. It was the one beautiful thing in a life that had run largely short of beauty. It was the physical proof that she had come from something softer than this, that there had been a world before Harrow's Bend, and that she had once been a part of it. Garrett Reed, the eldest child at 16, was his father's son in every outward particular. Broad-shouldered, capable, not given to reflection. He moved through the world with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had never had reason to doubt his place in it. He was not unkind to Willa. He simply had no particular need for her the way you have no particular need for a tool that performs a function you have never required. He acknowledged her existence when it was convenient and forgot it when it was not. Then there was Willa. The settlement understood the other three Reeds. It did not understand Willa, and what Harrow's Bend did not understand, it watched with narrowed eyes and a readiness to make up its mind. The person who did understand Willa was an old man named Edmund Walsh, and his understanding of her was one of the two great facts of her childhood, the other being the fact of her expulsion. Edmund lived in a small cabin at the very edge of the settlement. The last structure before the cleared land gave way to old growth, and he had lived there long enough that most people had stopped noticing him the way you stop noticing a particular tree or a fence post. He had been a trapper in the early days, then a trader, and in his final years, he had settled into wood carving with the complete absorption of a man who has finally found the thing he was always meant to do. His hands were ruined by decades of outdoor work, thickened at the knuckles, stiff in cold weather, mapped with old scars in the way that working hands always are. But those hands could produce things of extraordinary delicacy, birds mostly. Willa had watched him work many times sitting on the split log bench outside his cabin door, and the process never ceased to astonish her. He would take a block of wood, pale and featureless, and begin to remove everything that was not the bird. That was how he described it. Not building, but uncovering. The bird was already there. His job was simply to find it. Edmund had begun teaching Willa the summer she turned 9. Not formally, not with the word teaching ever spoken between them, but in the way that real teaching often happens through proximity and demonstration, and the quiet passing of attention from one person to another. He would take her on slow walks through the edge of the forest and show her things. The difference between the track of a doe and a buck in the soft mud by the creek. The mushrooms that were safe to eat and the ones that would kill you, and how to tell them apart, not just by the color of the cap, but by the smell and the color of the gills and the way they bruised when pressed. He showed her which bark could be stripped and boiled into a tea for fever, which plants could be packed against a wound to slow the bleeding. He showed her how to listen to the wind in different kinds of trees, the deep organ note of the pines different from the dry rattling whisper of the oaks, and what each sound told you about the weather coming. He taught her to use a knife, not as a weapon, but as a tool, which is the only way a knife should ever be thought of by someone who intends to be useful rather than merely dangerous. He gave her a small whittling knife and scraps of soft pine, and he showed her how to hold the wood and how to shave it in thin curls that fell to the ground like the world's smallest shavings. Her early attempts were lumpy, formless things that could have been anything. Edmund would pick them up, turn them slowly in his thick fingers, and say something like, "The wood wants to go this way, see," and she would see, and the next attempt would be fractionally better, and the one after that better still. He never praised her in ways that felt hollow. He acknowledged progress when it was real and ignored failure when it was honest. This was Willa understood, even at 9, a form of respect. He treated her the way he would have treated another craftsperson, another person in the process of learning a real thing. Not a child to be managed or a girl to be guided, but a mind that was trying to understand something difficult and deserved to be taken seriously in that effort. He taught her the names of trees not just by their leaves, but by their bark, the shaggy peeling layers of the birch, the deeply furrowed plates of the old oak, the long flat scales of the white pine. He showed her how to read terrain from a high point, how the land's shape told you where water would collect and where it would drain, how the density of undergrowth shifted depending on what lay beneath the surface. He taught her to identify animal runs, the narrow pressed corridors through the grass and brush, where the same creatures walked the same paths day after day, and how to distinguish a fresh track from an old one by the sharpness of its edges and the moisture content of the disturbed soil. He showed her how to build a fire in wet conditions, something most people in Harrow's Bend would have said was impossible. The trick, he explained, was not to fight the moisture, but to work around it. You began with the driest material available, the dead interior wood of a standing tree, rather than fallen wood, which always held moisture, regardless of how dry the surface appeared. You built your tinder from the finest possible shavings and protected them from any breath of wind until the flame was established enough to survive it. You graduated from tinder to kindling to fuel slowly, never rushing, never adding material faster than the fire could absorb it. Patience, he said, was the fundamental outdoor skill. Everything else was a specific application of patience. He showed her, too, how to navigate without landmarks, how to maintain a consistent bearing using the sun's position and its movement across the sky, how to correct for the ways the forest deceived you into circling the subtle visual repetition that made unfamiliar terrain feel like ground you had already covered. He showed her how to estimate distance traveled by counting her paces and how to translate that into a rough map held in the mind, updated with each new observation. All of this he gave her not in organized lessons, but in the natural rhythm of their time together, the information arriving when the situation called for it, lodging itself in her memory with the particular permanence of knowledge that has been immediately applied rather than abstractly absorbed. She did not study these things. She lived them in the hours spent beside him at the forest's edge and in the woods beyond. He gave her, too, the habit of silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has learned that observation requires stillness, that the world reveals itself most completely to those who do not interrupt it. She had already possessed a natural tendency toward quiet. Edmund recognized this and refined it, showed her how to convert what the settlement saw as a social failing into the most useful possible tool. For her 10th birthday, Edmund gave her a wren. He had carved it from a single piece of birch, and it was the finest thing she had ever held in her hands. Its head was cocked at an angle that captured exactly the quick, bright alertness of the living bird. The eye was a single point of burned ink. The wings were slightly spread, the tail lifted, every feather suggested, with an economy of line that was somehow more convincing than detail would have been. It sat in her palm as if it had landed there and might depart at any moment. She kept it in the pocket of her dress. In the long, silent evenings of the Minnesota winter, when her father sat by the fire saying nothing, and her mother mended clothes by failing lamplight, and Garrett slept his easy, uncomplicated sleep, Willa would close her fingers around the carved bird and feel the smooth, warm shape of the wood against her palm. It was a talisman. It was a reminder. It was the physical form of the one relationship in her life that had ever made her feel that being exactly who she was might be sufficient. Edmund died in the spring of the year Willa turned 11. Quietly in his sleep, in the way that the very old sometimes leave the world when they have finished their business in it. The settlement took what was useful from his cabin and burned the rest, which is what Harrow's Bend did with things it did not understand the value of. Willa managed to keep his small whittling knife, hiding it inside her dress until she could conceal it more securely in the loose boards beneath her sleeping pallet. And she kept the bird. The loss of Edmund was a quiet thing because Willa did not permit herself quiet things to be loud. She folded it away inside herself and continued. But she understood what she had lost. Not just a teacher, not just a companion, the only witness to the fact of her worth. The only person in Harrow's Bend who had ever looked at her and seen not a problem to be managed, but a person worth investing in. Without him, the settlement's assessment of her settled back into place like soil over a disturbed root, as if the years of his quiet advocacy had never happened. She continued to walk in the woods in her spare hours. She continued to observe and to practice the skills he had given her. checking snares she set and released without taking anything, reading the condition of the creek, identifying the first and last plants of each season. She did this not because it was useful in any immediate sense, but because it was the only activity that made her feel continuous with something connected to a larger pattern than the small, grinding world of the settlement. The people of Harrow's Bend watched her do it and found it further evidence of her strangeness. The trouble with the locket began on a Tuesday in early October. Edith Reed had worn the small gold oval every day of Willa's life. It was as much a part of her mother as her voice or her hands. When it disappeared, the absence was registered immediately before Edith had even fully awakened to what was missing, the way a person feels the wrongness of a room before they can identify what has been moved or removed. Edith searched the bedroom first methodically, then with increasing urgency. Then the main room. Then Garrett helped, moving furniture and checking behind the wood box and under the table. Then Harlan, whose searches were conducted with a thoroughness that looked like efficiency, but was actually something else entirely, a performance of certainty he needed to maintain for reasons Willa did not yet understand. The locket was not found. The particular silence that descended on the Reed cabin that afternoon was not the comfortable silence of people at ease with each other. It was the loaded silence of a verdict that has been privately reached and is waiting to be announced. Willa felt it the moment she came through the door from her afternoon work, her arms full of split kindling. She set the wood down by the stove and straightened and looked at her mother's face, and she knew. Edith's face was closed in the way of someone who has decided something painful. There was no anger in it, not yet, just a terrible stillness. The stillness of grief that is settled into blame, because blame is easier to live with than helplessness. "I saw you near the dresser yesterday morning," Edith said. Her voice was careful, the way a person is careful when they are saying something they know cannot be unsaid. "Standing right by it. I saw you." Willa looked at her mother. The afternoon before, she had been in the yard from before dawn until the light failed. She had not been in the bedroom. She had not touched the dresser. She said this clearly and quietly, without heat. The cabin was very still. Her father looked at the window. Garrett looked at the floor. That was what told her everything. Not her mother's accusation, which was at least animated by genuine grief. It was the studied blankness of her father's gaze, directed deliberately away from her face, and the particular quality of Garrett's sudden interest in the worn planks beneath his boots. There was something known in this room, something that had been decided before she walked through the door. She thought about that as she lay in her sleeping place that night, the carved bird warm in her closed fist. She was a child with a child's resources, which is to say very few. She had no proof of anything. She had only the knowledge she had always had, that she did not fit the space her family required her to fit, and that this had always been the essential problem. She was still thinking about it when she finally slept. She did not know, lying there in the dark, what she had failed to witness. She did not know that 3 weeks earlier, Harlan Reed had sat across a rough table from a man named Cobb Decker at the trading post, and that a brief exchange had taken place that involved a small gold locket passing from one set of hands to another in exchange for a folded collection of paper notes sufficient to cover a debt that Harlan had been carrying for longer than he intended. She did not know that Garrett had been in the trading shed that evening and had seen exactly what passed between his father and Cobb Decker. She did not know that her brother had gone home that night and lain awake until nearly dawn, and that he had ultimately chosen silence. Not malice. Silence. Which is a different thing and sometimes a worse one. She knew none of this. She would not know it for some time. She knew only that in the morning when she came in from hauling water, her father was standing at the door with the canvas sack she used for collecting herbs and mushrooms in the woods. It was hanging from his hand. She could see by the set of its fabric that it was not empty. He held it out to her. "You broke your mother's heart," he said. His voice was flat, completely empty of everything except the words themselves. "You'll not bring shame on this house any longer." She stood in the doorway with the water bucket and looked at his face. She examined it the way Edmund had taught her to examine things carefully, with full attention, without overlaying what she hoped to see onto what was actually there. What was there was a man who had made a decision and intended to keep it. She could see no crack in the certainty, no pocket of doubt that a word or a look might enter. The decision had already been executed. This was merely the notification. She set down the bucket. She took the sack. Her mother was somewhere behind him in the shadows of the main room, her face turned away. Garrett was not visible at all. She did not plead. She did not argue. She did not cry. The silence they had always found suspect in her now became the only appropriate response to this moment. She had been tried in the invisible court of her family's fear and disappointment, and the verdict had been delivered before she was called to give testimony. There was nothing left to say in that room. She nodded once, a small, precise movement. She adjusted the sack on her shoulder. She put her hand into her pocket and closed her fingers around the carved wren, feeling the familiar, smooth warmth of the wood. Then she turned and walked away from the cabin, past the woodpile she had split and stacked herself 3 days before, past the fence that marked the edge of the settlement's cleared land, and into the trees. She was 12 years old. The first day in the forest, she did not allow herself to feel anything except practical. This was not suppression so much as deliberate priority. She had been taught by a man who understood that in difficult conditions, feeling comes second to thinking, and thinking comes second to doing. There would be time for feeling later, if there was a later. For now, there was the immediate problem of water and shelter and the rapidly failing October light. She checked the sack. Her father had packed it himself, which told her the packing had been planned, which told her that the decision had not been made in the heat of the moment. Inside, a half loaf of dry bread, a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and her spare wool tunic. Enough food for 2, perhaps 3 days if she was careful. Enough warmth for a night that would not be the coldest night she would face. She angled downhill, listening for water. Edmund had taught her this: when you are lost, or when you need to orient yourself, go downhill. Water follows gravity. Gravity is the one thing the wilderness does not lie to you about. Within an hour, she heard it, a creek running over stones, and she knelt at its edge and drank with both hands the cold so sharp it was almost a sound. The first night, she built a lean-to from fallen branches against the base of a heavy pine, its low boughs already forming a natural roof that she supplemented with her own arrangement of smaller wood. She wedged herself inside her back against the tree's bark, the tunic wrapped around her shoulders over her cloak. She did not sleep well. The forest at night was a different country than the forest by day, its sounds rearranged into a language she understood technically, but felt differently. The long hoot of a great horned owl, the distant crack of something heavy moving through dry branches, the sound of the creek constant and indifferent. But she noticed in the hour before dawn, when she had finally drifted into something like sleep, that she was not afraid in the way she had expected to be. She was cold and she was uncertain, and she was hungry in the particular way of someone who has eaten half a portion and told themselves it is enough. But fear, the formless, overwhelming fear she had imagined might swallow her in the dark, did not come. What came instead was something closer to clarity. She was here. She was still here. She was still thinking. That was enough for now. The second day, she found late blackberries in a sunny clearing and ate a careful handful, knowing better than to take more. She found the tracks of a white-tailed deer in the mud near the creek and followed them long enough to understand where the animal had come from, which told her something about where the high ground was. She set no snares yet. She did not have material sufficient for snares that would reliably hold, and she did not want to waste what she had on attempts that would fail. Edmund had taught her that half measures in the wilderness were worse than no measures, because they gave you a false sense of having done something when you had done nothing at all. On the evening of the third day, she sat with her back against a birch tree and opened her hand and looked at the carved wren. She looked at it for a long time, not with grief exactly, though grief was present, more with attention. The way Edmund had looked at an uncarved block before he began that long, careful examination, reading what was already there. She turned the bird over, ran her thumb along the underside where the base was smooth and flat, different in texture from the carved surfaces above. Her thumb found a slight ridge. She pressed it. Nothing. She pressed again, rotating her grip, and felt something shift. She brought the bird up close to her eyes in the failing light. The base moved. Not much, a fraction of an inch, but deliberately like a fitted lid rather than a solid bottom. She worked at it with her thumbnail, careful not forcing the way Edmund had always told her never to force wood because the grain would tell you which way it wanted to go. Slowly, the base came free. It was a thin disc of birch, and beneath it, fitting exactly in the shallow hollow it had covered, was a piece of cured leather no larger than Willa's palm. The leather was folded twice. She opened it with fingers that had begun to tremble slightly, though whether from cold or from what she was feeling she could not have said. On the inside of the leather, someone had marked a series of symbols in neat, careful lines. A direction, a distance measured in the walking paces of a grown man which she would need to convert. And at the bottom, in Edmund Walsh's unmistakable hand, something she had to bring the leather close to read in the dimming light. The tree will know you. Go northwest. Count your steps. Trust what you find. She sat for a long time after reading it. Edmund Walsh had lived in Harrow's Bend for 11 years, and in that time she did not think he had done a single thing without deliberate intention. He was the least careless man she had ever known. He had given her the bird 2 years before he died, which meant he had placed this message inside it at least 2 years before he gave it to her, which meant he had considered this possibility, the possibility of this exact moment, her sitting alone in the October forest with nothing left, long before it arrived. He had not given her a keepsake. He had given her a map. She folded the leather carefully and replaced it beneath the base, which she pressed back into position with steady hands. She sat with the bird closed in her fist for another moment, feeling the familiar shape of it, and she thought about what it meant that a man who had died and left her alone in the world had also in the same act left her this. That was not abandonment. That was the opposite of abandonment. That was provision. She did not sleep much that night, but in the morning before the light had fully arrived, she stood up, adjusted the sack on her shoulder, took the leather piece from the bird, and held it open in one hand while she oriented herself to the pre-dawn sky and began to walk northwest. She counted her steps. The forest changed as she went deeper. She noticed it the way you notice a room changing when you have been in it long enough to understand its proportions. The trees grew larger, not older in the way of a tree that has been stressed by fire or drought, scarred and twisted, but older in the way of a tree that has simply never been interrupted. The trunks thickened past what seemed possible. The canopy closed overhead into something continuous, a roof that the light came through in long, slanted columns that lay across the forest floor like solid things. The understory thinned. There was less undergrowth here because less light reached the ground, and what grew did so in patches of fern and moss rather than the dense brush of the younger forest behind her. The sounds changed too. The wind moved through the upper canopy in a different register here, deeper and more resonant like sound inside a large building. The ordinary bird calls she had heard closer to the settlement were absent. In their place was an occasional sound she did not immediately recognize, a low fluting note from somewhere high in the bare branches that she eventually identified as the call of a white-throated sparrow passing through on its autumn migration. The sound was clear and pure and carried in the still air the way sounds carry inside a cathedral. She had been walking for most of the morning when she adjusted for the distance conversion and realized she must be close. She stopped, looked around. The forest here was cathedral quiet. The sound of the creek she had been following was muted present, but soft, like something heard through heavy walls. The light was the particular light of late morning and old growth, golden and indirect, moving slowly across the moss and the roots. Then she saw it. She had thought she was looking for a large tree. She had not understood what large meant in this context. The oak stood in a natural hollow between two low rises, and its size was not immediately comprehensible as a single object. It was more like a geological feature, a thing of the landscape rather than in it. The trunk was a sprawling, twisted mass of bark and wood, its base flanged out into great arching roots that gripped the earth like enormous fingers. The bark was thick and deeply furrowed gray-brown, ridged like the face of something that had seen everything and decided to say nothing about it. The canopy was bare now, October having stripped it, but the upper branches were so numerous and so wide-spreading that even bare they formed a kind of shelter, a frame against the sky. And in its side, facing away from the wind at approximately the height of a door, there was an opening. It was not ragged, not the result of lightning or rot in the way that produces collapse. It was a natural hollow formed over decades by the slow recession of a lost limb, the wood turning inward on itself in the patient circular way of trees, creating a chamber rather than a wound. The opening was tall and dark, framed by the curved interior of ancient oak, and it looked at her with the absolute neutrality of something that did not care whether she entered or not, but was also not trying to stop her. She stood at the edge of the hollow for a long moment. The air coming from inside smelled of dry wood and old leaves. Not rot, not damp, dry, preserved. The smell of something that had been sealed away from time long enough to have its own private climate. She held the carved bird in her hand and thought about Edmund Walsh, who had found this place or learned of it somehow, and had decided that she needed to know where it was before she knew why. She thought about what it meant that a man who had lived his whole life by the principle of exact and deliberate action had ended that life by leaving her this one last exact and deliberate thing. Then she stepped inside. The interior was larger than she could have imagined from the outside. That was the first thing. The second thing was the silence, which was not the forest silence, but a different quality of quiet, deeper and more specific, the silence of a space that has been enclosed long enough to develop its own atmosphere. The walls were the inner surface of the heartwood, dark and dense, ridged with the patterns of the grain impervious to the wind that moved through the upper canopy. The floor was packed earth and centuries of accumulated debris dry as dust. High above her, a smaller opening in the trunk allowed a thin column of light to descend straight and slow as a candle beam. The chamber was perhaps 8 feet across at its widest, imperfectly circular, high enough to stand without stooping. On the far side, a shallow depression in the floor where leaf matter had settled deeper. She looked at all of it with Edmund's eyes, which was the only way she knew how to look at things that mattered. She saw not what it was, but what it could be, what the wood already wanted it to be. She saw a door not built, but woven from the young saplings she had passed in the thicket by the last creek bend. She saw a hearth, the thick heartwood of the back wall, sufficient to withstand a small and careful fire. She saw a floor that could be cleared, a space that could be made habitable. A shelter that was already more sound and weatherproof than anything she could have constructed in a week of outdoor labor. She set down her canvas sack in the center of the floor. The small sound it made when it touched the earth rose briefly in the enclosed space and then settled, and the silence closed back over it. She was 12 years old. She had been cast out of the only home she had ever known for a crime she had not committed. She had walked for 4 days through an October forest with nothing but what she could carry and the knowledge an old man had spent years leaving inside a carved wooden bird. She looked around at the dark curved walls, at the beam of light from above, at the potential that filled this space the way water fills the shape of whatever contains it. Something that was not quite peace but was the precursor of peace. The first conditions in which peace becomes possible settled into the hollow of her chest. She had found it. The tree had been waiting. And the work of making this place a home, the long, deliberate, necessary work that would occupy the weeks ahead, had not yet begun. But the worst thing the moment before, beginning the vast emptiness of having nothing and know where that moment was over. She knelt on the packed earth floor and ran her palm across its surface, feeling the solidness of it, the reality of it, the way you press your hand against something to confirm that it is real and not imagined. Then she squared her shoulders in the way Edmund had always squared his, when he was about to begin a new piece of work, took a flat piece of bark from the edge of the chamber and began to clear the floor. The floor took 3 days to clear. She worked from the entrance inward, using the flat piece of bark as a shovel, scraping the accumulated centuries of leaf matter and loose soil into her arms, and carrying it outside in loads, piling it against the base of the tree, where it would serve as additional insulation against the cold that was coming. The work was slow and repetitive, and it asked nothing of her except her body, which was a relief. Her mind left unoccupied, would have done things she could not afford. So she focused on the texture of the debris beneath her hands, the change in density as she worked deeper, the smell of the earth as she turned it, and she moved back and forth between the interior and the outside world with the steady, metronomic rhythm of someone building something, which is always the best answer to the question of what to do when everything has been taken from you. It was on the afternoon of the third day working in the far corner of the chamber that the piece of bark struck something that rang different. Not the dull resistance of a root or the hard knock of a buried stone. This was a flat, hollow sound, a sound with a cavity beneath it, like knocking on a wooden floor and finding that the space below is empty. She stopped, set down the bark, knelt and brushed the loose soil aside, with her palms working slowly the way Edmund had taught her to approach anything unfamiliar in the field, with patience and full attention and the willingness to let the thing reveal itself rather than forcing the revelation. What emerged from beneath the soil was the edge of a flagstone, square cut, flat, gray. Unlike any of the other rocks she had turned up in her clearing, which were rounded field stones, the kind that water makes. This one had been shaped. Its edges were too regular, its surface too deliberately flat to be anything other than the work of a human hand placed with human intention. A root had grown across one edge, thick as her wrist, anchoring the stone in place with the slow, absolute authority of something that has had years to commit to its position. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. Then she drew the hunting knife from her belt. It was a blade she had found among the sparse supplies in the canvas sack and taken to carrying on principle, understanding that a larger edge would serve her where Edmund's fine whittling knife could not. She worked the edge of it beneath the root where it crossed the stone and began to saw. The root was tough and fibrous, and it did not give easily. She worked at it steadily for the better part of an hour, the effort warming her through the chill of the enclosed chamber, and when the root finally parted, it did so with a sound like a rope going slack. She wedged her fingers into the gap. The stone was heavier than it looked. She set her feet, adjusted her grip, and pulled with everything she had, and the stone shifted, scraped across the packed earth with a sound that seemed enormous in the enclosed space, and tilted up and away. Beneath it was a cavity. Not a natural cavity, not the kind that forms when a root decays or a stone settles. A dug cavity, rectangular, its walls the compacted clay that lay below the topsoil, its interior dark and still and dry. And inside that cavity, fitting it the way an object fits a space made for it, was a bundle. Dark canvas oiled against moisture, bound with a leather thong tied in a knot that had stiffened with age but still held. She lifted it out of the cavity with both hands. It was heavier than its size suggested, and she carried it to the entrance of the hollow where the afternoon light was better, and set it down and knelt over it and worked the leather thong loose with careful fingers. She unfolded the canvas. Inside, nested in a bed of dry moss that had kept its shape through years of compression, were three things. The first was a leather pouch, its drawstring pulled tight. She worked it open and poured the contents into her palm. Coins. Silver heavy, old enough that their edges were worn smooth and their markings faint with handling, but unmistakably real, unmistakably valuable. She counted them twice, her lips moving silently. 23 coins in all. More money than she had ever held. More money she suspected than her family had in liquid form at any given moment. Which was not a small thing to understand about your circumstances when you are 12 years old and have been sent into the forest with a half loaf of bread and told not to come back. The second object was a knife, larger than Edmund's whittling knife, larger than anything she had carried before. This was a trapper's skinning knife, its blade of dark steel that had been kept sharp even through the years of storage, its wooden handle worn to a perfect smoothness that spoke of long daily use by hands that knew their work. It was a tool of extraordinary quality, the kind of object that outlasted the person who made it and the person who first owned it and kept on being useful long after it had any right to still exist. The third object was a book. Its leather cover was warped with age, stiff when she tried to open it, the pages inside crackling at the edges like something pressed long past the point of softness. She opened it with the care she would have given a living thing slowly without forcing. The pages were covered in small, dense handwriting. The ink faded from black to a deep, uncertain brown that was still legible in good light. It was a journal. Months and years marked at the tops of entries, the writing sometimes cramped and hurried and sometimes expansive, depending on what the day had required. She leafed through it slowly, reading fragments. November 14th. Snow came in the night and covered the entrance entirely. Spent the morning digging out. Saw elk tracks at the creek, 3 animals, the large one limping. February 2nd. The cold this week is different from the cold before. It has intention. April 9th. The first crow. Just one. But it came. She turned to the front of the journal. There, tucked into the space between the cover and the first page, was a folded piece of paper. Heavy stock, once white, now the color of old cream. Sealed with a disc of red wax that had gone brittle with age and crumbled when she touched it. On the outside of the fold, in the same hand as the journal entries, careful and precise, a few words. To whoever finds this. She broke the remaining seal. She unfolded the paper. My name is Nathaniel Cole. I came to this hollow in the autumn of 1831, and I lived here for 2 winters before my health made it necessary for me to seek a settlement. I did not die here, though there were nights I believed I would. I am writing this in the spring of 1833 before I leave, because I am not the kind of man who can take without giving something back, even if what I give is given to someone I will never meet. I came to these woods because I had nowhere else to go. I will not explain the details of why at length, because the details do not matter. What matters is this: I was accused of something I did not do. The community I had lived in for 4 years decided, in the way that frightened communities make their decisions, that I was the most convenient explanation for a problem they needed explained. I was cast out with nothing. I walked north until I found this tree, and this tree kept me alive when I had given up expecting anything from the world to do so. The coins in the pouch are 2 seasons of trapping income, honest money earned by hard work and careful living. I have no family to leave it to, and I would rather it serve someone who needs it than sit in the ground until the ground swallows it entirely. The knife was my father's. It is the finest tool I have ever owned. I hope it serves you as well as it served both of us. The journal is my record of 2 years in this place. I leave it because I believe there is value in knowing that someone was here before you and was afraid and was cold and found a way forward anyway. You are not the first. You will not be the last. I do not know who you are or what brought you here. I do not know if you are young or old, man or woman, whether you arrived by choice or necessity. I know only that you are here, and that means you needed to be, and that the oak that sheltered me is offering to shelter you, and that this is not nothing. Use what I have left. Build not just a shelter, but a life. Do not let what was done to you become the whole of what you are. To whoever finds this, may it be your anchor in the storm. Nathaniel Cole, May 1833. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she sat back against the curved wall of the hollow with the letter open in her hands and the late afternoon light falling across the page, and she did not move for a long time. She had been sent out of her home for something she did not do. She had walked 4 days through an October forest with almost nothing. She had found a hollow in an ancient tree, following a map left inside a carved bird by a dead man who had believed she would one day need it. And beneath the floor of that hollow, a stranger who had been dead for 14 years had left her money and tools and words and the specific necessary information that she was not the first person to have been here. To have needed this, to have arrived at this dark doorway with nothing and found that the tree was willing to be enough. She was 12 years old, and she had not cried since the morning she walked out of Harrow's Bend. She cried now. Not loudly and not for long and not in the collapsed, helpless way of someone who has given up. She cried the way a person cries when something they needed very badly has finally arrived, the specific release of a tension that has been held too long and is now at last permitted to let go. She pressed the letter against her chest, and she cried until she was finished. and then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, folded the letter carefully along its original creases, and placed it back inside the front cover of the journal. Then she got up and went back to work. The weeks that followed were the most purposeful of her life. She began with the door. Edmund had shown her once how the people of the deep wilderness made walls from young saplings, and she had filed the knowledge away in the place where she kept everything. He taught her the place that she understood now had been filling up for years against exactly this kind of need. She cut a dozen saplings from the thicket by the creek, each one the thickness of her thumb, and she brought them back to the hollow in armloads. She stripped the side branches and laid the poles side by side, then wove thinner, more flexible withes between them horizontally, lashing each crossing point with strips of bark soaked in the creek until they were pliable. The work took 2 full days. The result was a mat of woven wood dense and interlocking, heavy enough to require both her arms to move, but sturdy enough that when she set it in the opening of the hollow and pressed against it from the outside, it did not shift. It was not a door in the conventional sense, it was a barrier. But barriers she understood were what the situation required. She addressed the fire next because without heat, nothing else she built would matter past the first hard freeze. The problem was the obvious one. An open fire in the center of a wooden chamber is not a fire, it is an ending. She needed containment and she needed ventilation, and she needed both without materials she did not have. The flagstone that had covered Nathaniel's cache became the base of her hearth. She set it against the thickest section of the interior wall, the back curve where the heartwood was densest and least likely to catch. Around it, she built a small surround of creek stones, each one selected for flatness, and carried back in her arms over the course of 3 trips to the water. She packed the gaps between the stones with clay from the creek bank, mixed with dry grass to give it body, and let it harden. The chimney was harder. She spent nearly a week on it, working with clay and grass and small stones, building a narrow, upward angling column from the back of the hearth toward the upper hole in the trunk that let in the single beam of light. She built it in sections, letting each section harden before adding the next, climbing higher each day. When she finally connected the last section to the opening above, she built a small fire in the hearth, no larger than her 2 fists together, and sat back and watched. The smoke lifted, moved sideways, then straightened as the draft caught it, rose in a thin, wobbling column toward the opening above, and disappeared. The hollow filled not with smoke, but with warmth radiating outward from the stone and clay in steady, even waves. The firelight moved on the dark walls of the heartwood, warm orange and amber against the dense brown-black of the wood, and for a moment she sat completely still and just felt it. Warmth. Enclosed warmth. The specific comfort of being inside when the world outside is cold. She let herself have that moment. Then she built the bed. She could not sleep on the ground. Not through a Minnesota winter, not with the cold that would come. She had seen what cold coming up through the ground could do to a body, how it robbed heat faster than any amount of clothing could replace it. She needed elevation. She cut heavier branches for the frame, lashing them together at the corners, with more bark strips, and wove a lattice of flexible boughs across the top to form a surface. On this she piled armful after armful of pine boughs, their needles still holding their resin and their springiness layer after layer until the bed was 6 inches deep and fragrant and softer than anything she had slept on in years. She set her snares in the second week when the immediate construction was sufficient to let her turn attention elsewhere. Edmund had shown her the basic principle, a loop of twisted plant fibers set along a game trail at the right height, supported on a bent sapling that would spring upright when triggered. She set 5 of them in the most promising locations she could find, places where the mud showed regular traffic and the undergrowth was pressed back by repeated passage. Over the following days, she checked them each morning, and by the end of the week, she had taken 3 rabbits. The cleaning and preparation was work she had observed but not performed herself. She did it methodically with Nathaniel's knife, the trapper's blade she had found in the cache, and now understood to be a tool of serious craftsmanship, following the logic of the process rather than memory of instruction. She was not efficient at first, but efficiency is the product of repetition, and she was willing to repeat. She stretched the pelts on a frame of sticks she had cut for the purpose. And while they dried, she cooked the meat directly on the hearthstone, salting it sparingly with a small quantity of salt she had taken from the emergency stores her mother kept behind the flour bin. She allowed herself to think about her mother only when it served a purpose. When she did, it was with a specific and contained ache that she recognized as grief but refused to let become preoccupation. Edith Reed was a woman who had been worn too thin by disappointment to have enough left over for the kind of careful seeing that her daughter required. That was not malice. It was a different kind of tragedy, the tragedy of a person who runs out of capacity before they run out of need. Willa understood this, the way she understood the cold as a condition of the world that she was required to navigate, not a moral failing she was required to correct. Her father she did not think about at all. Or rather, when she found herself beginning to think about him, she redirected her attention with the firmness she had learned from Edmund, who had taught her that the mind is a tool, and tools are meant to be directed by the person holding them, not the other way around. It was in the long evenings when the work of the day was done and the fire was burning low and the hollow was warm and quiet that she read the journal. She read it slowly, a few pages at a time, the way you eat when you want the food to last. Nathaniel Cole's handwriting was small and deliberate economical, with paper in the way of someone who knows they have a finite supply and cannot get more. His observations were precise, his language plain. He noted temperatures, snowfall depths, the behavior of animals. He observed near the hollow the success or failure of his trapping runs. He recorded what he ate, and when the condition of his tools, the small repairs and improvements he made to the space that she now occupied. Reading him was like having a conversation with someone who was not there. He described the exact hearth-building process she had worked out for herself, and she felt a strange satisfaction at having arrived independently at the same conclusions a man with far more experience had reached. He described the game trails she had already found, the same thicket of young saplings she had harvested for her door, the creek in the same terms she would have used. He had lived in this exact space, looked at these exact walls, listened to this exact silence. In the middle of the journal, toward the end of his first winter, she found the page she had been approaching without knowing she was approaching it. He had written it in longer strokes than usual, as if what he needed to say required more space. I have had much time to think about what brought me here, and I find I am no longer angry about it in the way I was. I am something else. I am interested in the mechanism. What I mean by this is the following. I was accused of stealing a silver-handled knife that belonged to the settlement's overseer, a man named Forsyth. I had not taken it. Forsyth had sold it privately to cover a debt he was ashamed of, and when his wife noticed the knife was gone, he needed an explanation that would not require him to confess. I was the explanation. I was the right shape for the space that needed filling. I was quiet and solitary, and not particularly well connected, and I had no family nearby to make noise on my behalf. I understand now that it was never about the knife. It was about finding someone to blame who had no voice loud enough to matter. That is the mechanism. That is how these things work. And understanding the mechanism does not absolve the people who operated it, but it does clarify something. The wrong that was done to me was not personal. It was structural. I was not selected because I was despised. I was selected because I was available. I do not know if this distinction will matter to anyone else. It matters to me. Willa read this section 3 times. She thought about her father's face at the door looking past her toward the tree line. She thought about Garrett's careful study of the cabin floor. She thought about her mother's voice, flat with the particular flatness of someone who has already decided and is simply announcing. She thought about the word available. She set the journal down and looked at the fire for a long time. Then she picked it up again and kept reading. Her one trip to the trading post came in the 3rd week of November, when the first real cold had settled, and she had established enough of the hollow's infrastructure to feel that she could afford 3 days away from it. The trading post was known to her from Edmund's descriptions, a low, broad building at the junction of 2 rough tracks, serving the scattered trappers and homesteaders of the region. She had never been there herself, but she knew the direction, and she could navigate by sun and by the landmarks she had been accumulating since her first day in the forest. She took two of Nathaniel's silver coins and nothing else of value. The man behind the counter of the trading post was old enough to have given up being curious about customers who did not volunteer information. He sold her a small sack of flour, a block of salt larger than the one she had nearly exhausted, and a tin of matches with the specific absence of expression that distinguished a professional merchant from a merely polite one. She paid with one coin. The change came back in smaller currency that she recognized as current. She pocketed it without counting it in front of him and left. She did not speak more than 6 words in the trading post. No one asked her name. No one asked where she came from or where she was going. The world she was learning would allow you to be invisible if you were quiet enough and purposeful enough and did not carry anything about you that invited questions. She walked back to the hollow in 2.5 days, moving faster on the return because she knew the route and the weather was holding. The last half day she traveled in light snow, the first of the season, small dry flakes that sifted through the canopy and settled on the brown leaves without sound. By the time she reached the ancient oak, it was dark and the snow was an inch deep and the cold had teeth. She hung the woven door into place behind her, lit the fire from the tin of matches, and set the flour sack on the carved shelf she had built along the interior wall, using flat stones and notched branches. She sat on the edge of her bed and watched the fire and listened to the snow arrive outside, the slight change in the quality of the silence as the white accumulated and muffled the world further. She realized, not afraid. She was cold and she was isolated, and she was 12 years old and entirely alone in the deep forest in the beginning of a Minnesota winter. By any conventional measure, her situation was serious. But she had a door between her and the wind, and a fire built on a flagstone hearth with a chimney that drew clean, and a bed of pine boughs with a rabbit-skin blanket that she had stitched herself from 8 skins, using a sharpened bone and sinew and flour enough for flatbread for weeks, and salted rabbit meat hanging on the hook she had carved from green wood and driven into the wall above the hearth. She had Nathaniel Cole's journal, and she had Edmund Walsh's whittling knife, and she had 21 silver coins in a leather pouch that she kept inside her spare tunic at all times. She had everything she needed. That was not a thought that arrived with triumph or even with particular relief. It arrived with the quiet completeness of a factual assessment. She had done the necessary things, and the necessary things had produced the necessary result. And here she was, inside, warm, provisioned, in possession of a shelter that the winter could not easily penetrate. She had built this, with her hands and with the knowledge Edmund had given her, and with the materials Nathaniel had left, and with the particular kind of intelligence that manifests not as brilliance, but as sustained, patient attention to what needs doing next. She had built it, and it was hers in the only way that actually matters, not because anyone had given it to her or because she had paid for it, but because she had made it out of almost nothing over the course of 3 weeks of unrelenting work. She lay down on the pine bough bed and pulled the rabbit-skin blanket over her and looked up at the interior curve of the ancient heartwood above her, dark and close in the firelight. The winter deepened. It came the way northern winters always do, with an escalating seriousness of purpose that leaves no room for doubt about its intentions. The creek froze to its edges then in thin sheets toward the center. The temperature on the coldest nights fell to places where the air had a quality to it that was beyond cold in the conventional sense, a sharpness that caught in the chest and made every breath deliberate. The snow came in earnest 3 and 4 inches at a time, and then a storm that brought 2 feet in a day and a half and left the forest transformed into a white, compressed silence that was like nothing else on earth. Willa moved through it with the practiced efficiency she was still developing. She had built a second outer barrier for the doorway, a simple frame woven with evergreen boughs that broke the wind before it reached the woven door, and between the two her entrance held a pocket of relatively still air that made the difference between a drafty shelter and a warm one. She kept the fire small and consistent, understanding from Nathaniel's journal that a small sustained fire was more efficient than a large intermittent one and created less risk of the smoke or heat building to a point where the old wood became a problem. Her days had a shape. She rose when the quality of light through the upper hole changed from black to gray. She fed the fire. She ate a small breakfast from her store's flatbread cooked on the hearthstone or the last of the previous day's smoked meat. She checked her snares in the early morning, resetting any that had been triggered, moving any that seemed to have been discovered and abandoned by the animals whose trails she was reading. She came back and processed whatever she had caught, adding to her stores, working the pelts. She gathered firewood in the early afternoon when her body was warmest from the morning's exertion. She came back and worked on whatever needed attention inside the constant small maintenance that a functional shelter requires. A stone that had worked loose in the chimney surround a section of the woven door that needed reinforcement, a new tool that she had identified a need for and was in the process of making. In the evening, she read. She read Nathaniel Cole's journal from the beginning more than once, and she read it the way you read something that is not only telling you a story, but teaching you the way the instruction and the narrative are inseparable. She read his descriptions of what worked and what failed, his observations about animal behavior in extreme cold, his notes on the edible plants that persisted under the snow if you knew where to look and what to look for. She read his philosophical entries with a different kind of attention. The entries where he wrote not about the practical details of wilderness survival, but about the experience of being alone with himself over a long period of time. He wrote in the third month of his first winter, "I have come to understand something that I think most people who live in communities never discover because the community never gives them the chance. Most of what we believe about ourselves is actually what other people have told us. When there is no one to tell you what you are, you have to find out on your own. This is terrifying. And then if you survive the terror, it becomes the most interesting thing that has ever happened to you." She understood this. She was living it. She was not the quiet, unhelpful girl her family had seen. She was not the odd one, the liability, the too still child who made people uneasy. She was a person who had built a functional shelter in 3 weeks from materials available in a forest. She was a person who had learned to skin and smoke and salt meat, to build a chimney, to read game trails, to move through a winter forest without leaving unnecessary evidence of her passage. She was a person who had taken the knowledge of a dead man and the provisions of another dead man and woven them into a life that was by any reasonable measure not just viable but good. The community at Harrow's Bend had seen someone they did not understand and called her strange. The forest had simply called her able. On the worst night of that winter, a night when the temperature fell past anything the thermometer at the trading post could measure, and the cold pressed against the hollow with a physical weight, she lay in her bed with Nathaniel's knife in her hand and the journal open on her chest, and the fire reduced to the smallest flame she could maintain without losing it entirely, and she was not afraid. She was alert, and she was careful, and she was fully, precisely present in her circumstances, which is the only appropriate response to a situation that requires everything you have. She tended the fire through the hours of deepest cold, adding wood in small increments, watching the flame adjusting the airflow through the chimney with a flat stone she had positioned for exactly this purpose. By morning, the cold had relented slightly, and she went outside into a world so brilliantly white and still that it seemed constructed rather than natural, every surface covered in the deep freeze of a night that had taken no prisoners. Her breath came in visible clouds. The creek was silent under its ice. The forest held itself in the frozen posture of something enduring. She stood in the entrance of the hollow and looked at all of it and felt for the first time since October something that was not purely practical in its nature, something that was closer to wonder. She had survived the worst night of the worst winter in a wooden chamber she had built herself from almost nothing in a forest that was 40 miles from the nearest settlement of any size, and she was standing here in the cold morning light without a single thing wrong with her. She was 12 years old. She went inside and made flatbread. Spring came the way springs come in the north, slowly, then in a rush. The snow settled and compressed and then began to recede from the south-facing slopes. First dark patches of leaf litter emerging like something surfacing after a long submersion. The creek opened up from the center outward, and the sound of running water returned to the hollow's proximity like the return of something that had been missed without being specifically named. The air shifted from the dry, mineral cold of deep winter to something softer, carrying the first trace of earth smell of green things, waking up under the ground of the particular urgency of a northern spring that has only a few months to accomplish everything before the cold returns. Willa came outside and sat on the great gnarled root at the hollow's entrance and turned her face up to the sun, which was still thin but real, and felt it on her skin, and said nothing, and felt no need to say anything. It was on a morning in early April that she saw him. She was mending a section of the outer bough barrier that the last wind had loosened, standing on the root to reach the upper ties, when she became aware of a stillness at the edge of the small natural clearing in front of the hollow. Not the passive stillness of the forest when nothing is happening, the active stillness of something present and observing. She had learned the difference over the winter. She turned slowly. He was standing at the tree line 60 feet away, tall, lean, dressed in worn buckskins that had been repaired so many times in so many places that they were more repair than original material. He carried a long rifle, its stock resting in the crook of his arm, barrel up in the relaxed posture of someone who has been carrying a rifle for so many decades that it has ceased to feel like anything separate from his own arm. His beard was gray shot through with white, his face a topographic map of years spent outside, in conditions that did not care about comfort. He was looking at the hollow with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things in the wilderness and has just encountered one that he was not expecting. She did not move. She stood on the root and watched him the way she had learned to watch things, with full attention and no telegraphed intention, reading what was there rather than responding to what she feared might be there. He raised his right hand palm outward, open. No weapon in it. The oldest signal there is. She did not raise hers immediately. She looked at his face from across the clearing, and she read what was there. Not menace, not predation, not the particular alertness of someone who has found something they intend to take. What was there was surprise, and beneath the surprise, something that looked like professional recognition. He was reading the hollow the way she had learned to read the forest. He was looking at the woven door, the outer bough barrier, the stack of split firewood, the smoke lifting in a thin thread from the upper opening in the trunk, and he was arriving at accurate conclusions about what those things represented and who had made them. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with respect. She lowered herself slowly from the root, her hand still close to the knife at her belt, and stood on the open ground in front of the hollow and waited. He took his time coming across the clearing, the way experienced outdoorsmen move without hurry, making no sudden transitions, giving the thing they are approaching time to decide what it wants to do. When he was 20 feet away, he stopped again. "My name is Solomon Greer," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who speaks rarely enough that he has never developed the habit of filling silences. "I've been working these woods for 40 years. He looked past her at the hollow, at the smoke, at the evidence of a winter spent in deliberate, purposeful habitation. "I have never seen anything quite like this." She said nothing, still reading him. He nodded slightly as if her silence was a reasonable response and he had expected nothing else. His eyes dropped to the knife at her belt. Nathaniel's knife, the trapper's blade with its worn wooden handle. They widened fractionally and then narrowed again. He said quietly, as if saying it too loud might break something, "That knife belonged to Nathaniel Cole." She looked at him steadily. "You knew him," she said. It was not a question. He nodded. Knew of him. Every trapper working this range knew Nathaniel Cole, or knew his name. He came through here in 31. He paused. He had some bad luck. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He didn't deserve what happened to him." She held his gaze. "No," she said. "He didn't." Solomon Greer looked at her for a long moment in the way of someone recalibrating something. Then he did something she had not expected. He sat down on the nearest root set, his rifle across his knees, and said nothing, in the specific way of someone who has arrived at a place and intends to stay for a while and is comfortable with the silence in the meantime. She sat down on the root opposite him, and they were quiet together for a minute, which is an old and legitimate form of conversation between people who know how to mean something by silence. Then he said, "The trading post down at the junction. You been there recently?" Once she said, "In November." He was looking at the ground in front of him, turning something over. Then he looked up at her directly the way a man looks when he has decided to say a thing that needs to be said plainly. "I was there 3 weeks back," he said, "running in my winter pelts. There was a man from up the ridge, settlement called Harrow's Bend." She went very still. He kept his eyes on her and did not look away. "His name was Harlan Reed. He was doing business with Cobb Decker, who works that post." He said it steady, no softening in the delivery, the way you tell a person a hard truth when you have decided they are capable of receiving it. "I saw what changed hands. A gold locket, small oval engraved on the face. Reed sold it to Decker, paid off something he owed." The clearing was very quiet. Willa looked at the root system at her feet, the great branching architecture of the oak spreading outward across the earth, holding the tree in place across centuries of storms. She thought about her mother's face the morning the locket was discovered missing, the specific quality of her grief, the way it had curdled so quickly into accusation. She thought about her father's voice at the door. Flat, empty. "You'll not bring shame on this house any longer." She thought about Nathaniel Cole writing by firelight in this same space 14 years ago. It was never about the knife. It was about finding someone to blame who had no voice loud enough to matter. She sat with what Solomon had told her for a long time. Then she asked, "Can you say that in front of others, what you saw?" Solomon Greer looked at her without flinching. "Man my age," he said, "spent 40 years alone in the woods, hasn't got much use for keeping quiet about what he knows to be true." He said it simply, without drama, the way facts are stated by people who have no investment in anything except the facts themselves. She nodded once, a small, precise movement. The same nod she had given her father at the door, but this time with something behind it that the earlier nod had not contained. Not resignation, not defeat, recognition. She looked past Solomon Greer at the old trees standing in the spring light, their bare branches beginning to show the first faint green of new buds, the season turning with its absolute indifferent fidelity, and she felt something settle inside her deep down in the place where the hardest things are kept. She had known she was innocent. She had always known. Now someone else knew too. Solomon Greer did not stay long that first morning. He was a man of circuits and routines, his trap lines running in a wide arc through the old growth that took him 3 weeks to complete before he circled back, and he had miles yet to cover before dark. He stood when he was ready to go, no performance in the rising, just a man getting to his feet because it was time. He picked up his rifle. He looked at the hollow one more time with that same expression of professional assessment. "You've done good work here," he said. He did not say it the way adults say encouraging things to children. He said it the way one craftsperson says it to another, as a statement of observed fact. Then he walked back into the trees and was gone, his buckskins dissolving into the dappled pattern of the forest with the practiced ease of someone the wilderness had long since accepted as one of its own. Willa stood at the entrance of the hollow and watched the place where he had disappeared until she was certain he was not coming back, and then she went inside and sat by the cold hearth and thought about what he had told her. She thought about it for the rest of that day and into the night, and what she arrived at finally in the small hours when the fire had burned to coals and the hollow was warm and dark and quiet was something she had not expected to feel. Not anger, not the specific heat of vindication, the desire to return to Harrow's Bend and stand in the center of the settlement and make them all look at her and know what they had done. What she felt was quieter than that, and she suspected more durable. It was the particular piece of a person who has always known the truth about themselves and has now received confirmation from the external world that their private knowledge was correct all along. The world had caught up to what she already knew. That was all. It changed her circumstances significantly. It did not change who she was because who she was had never been in question, at least not to her. She would think about what to do with Solomon's testimony in time. For now, spring was arriving with its own urgent demands, and the hollow required her attention. The weeks that followed the snow's retreat were the busiest she had known. The forest in spring was a different proposition than the forest in winter. In winter, the wilderness contracted, became spare and austere, reduced to its essential elements, and a person living in it was required to do the same. In spring, it expanded in every direction simultaneously, and a person living in it could expand along with it, reaching outward into the abundance that the warming earth was producing at a rate that seemed almost reckless after the long months of scarcity. She found fiddlehead ferns pushing through the leaf litter near the creek and ate them boiled on the hearthstone. She found wild onions in a sunny clearing and pulled handfuls of them, their sharp, clean smell cutting through the last of the winter's close air. She found a stand of watercress in the shallows of the creek where a backwater pool had formed behind a fallen log, and she ate it by the handful, standing knee-deep in the cold water, tasting the green mineral freshness of it, and felt something in her body respond with a gratitude that was almost overwhelming in its specificity. This was what winter did. It made you forget what alive tasted like. And then spring brought it back, and you understood for the first time how much you had missed it. She extended her snare lines, setting new traps along the game trails she had mapped over the winter trails that she knew now with the intimacy of long familiarity, every bend and open stretch, every place where the undergrowth pressed close, and every place where it opened. She began to work the creek more systematically, learning the pools where fish gathered in the warming water, fashioning a rudimentary weir from sticks and stones that channeled them into a smaller space where they could be taken by hand or by a sharpened stick in the patient, unhurried way that Edmund had described to her once. She expanded the hollow itself. Along the outer wall on the sheltered side where the morning sun struck, first she cleared the ground for 10 feet in each direction and turned the soil with a stick, working it until it was loose and dark. She had no seeds, but she planted what she had gathered, the bulbs of wild onions. The roots of plants she recognized as edible, the tubers she had found along the creek bank and set aside against exactly this purpose. It was not a garden in any formal sense. It was an intention, a declaration of permanence, the act of someone who is planning to be in a place long enough for things to grow. Solomon came back on a Thursday in late April, or what she calculated to be a Thursday by her count of days, which she had been keeping with small marks carved into the inner wall of the hollow since the beginning. She saw him coming from a greater distance this time because the trees were leafing out, and the filtered green light was different from the stark, bare-branched light of his first visit. And somehow in that changed light she saw him sooner, a figure moving through the undergrowth with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned long ago that haste in the forest was almost always a mistake. He sat on the same root as before. She sat on the same root as before. This time she had food to offer, smoked rabbit in a flat piece of bread cooked that morning, and she set it on a clean piece of bark between them without ceremony. And he took it without ceremony, and they ate together in the comfortable silence of people who had already established the important things about each other. He told her what he had seen on his circuit, a wolverine denning in a rocky outcrop 3 miles northeast, the creek running higher than usual from the snowmelt, a homestead to the south that had not made it through the winter, the family gone back east, or worse, the cabin standing empty and already beginning to collapse back into the land. He told her these things the way a man reports on the condition of a territory he is responsible for. Because in some fundamental sense, that was what Solomon Greer was, a man who felt responsible for the wild country he moved through, its chronicler and its quiet guardian. In exchange, she told him about the hollow, about what she had found and what she had built and how. She showed him the chimney, which he examined with close attention and genuine respect. She showed him Nathaniel Cole's cache, the empty cavity beneath the flagstone, the pouch and the knife and the journal which she had treated with the care you give something irreplaceable. She read him the letter. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished reading the letter, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the carved shelf above the hearth, where the journal now sat between 2 stones she had placed as bookends. "I never knew what became of him," Solomon said finally. "Nathaniel Cole." He looked at the journal. "Good to know the tree kept him." "It kept me too," she said. He nodded. He looked at her directly the way he had at the end of their first meeting, with that quality of assessment that was entirely free of condescension. Then he reached into the pack he had set down by the entrance and brought out something wrapped in burlap. Steel needle and a spool of thread, he said. Good ones. He set the package on the ground between them. I've got rabbit pelts I haven't time to work. If you can cure them and sew them out, I'll trade you for whatever you find most useful. It was not charity. She understood immediately and with complete clarity that it was not charity. It was a business proposition between two people who had complementary skills and resources. She was being invited to participate in a small functional economy of mutual benefit, one that recognized what she could do rather than what she lacked. She said, "What do you need most?" He thought about it. A reliable camp cache in this section of the territory. Somewhere to leave provisions when I'm ranging far from the post. Somewhere they won't be found or spoiled. She said the hollow has space, and she said it in the tone of someone proposing terms, not granting a favor. He said, fair enough. They shook hands on it, which is how agreements between serious people are sealed, regardless of the age of one party and the circumstances of the other. Agnes Whitmore appeared on a morning in May. Willa heard the horse before she saw her, which was unusual. The deep forest muffled most sounds, and she had grown accustomed to the relative quiet of her surroundings, punctuated by the expected bird calls and wind patterns and the distant sound of the creek. A horse was different. A horse was someone making no effort at all to arrive quietly, which meant they were not concerned about being heard, which meant they were not approaching with any intent they needed to conceal. She stood in the entrance of the hollow and watched a stout, gray-haired woman in a practical dark dress ride a broad bay horse through the trees with the posture of someone who had been riding long enough that the horse was simply another way of walking. Behind her, a man on a second horse, younger, probably a son, carrying something across his saddle. The woman pulled up at the edge of the clearing and looked at the hollow and looked at Willa with eyes that were direct and intelligent and entirely without alarm. "You're the girl in the oak," she said. The way she said it, it was not a question, and it was not an accusation. It was an identification, the way you identify a landmark you have heard described and are now seeing for the first time. A recognition of something that has already established itself as a feature of the landscape. "I'm Agnes Whitmore," she said. "My husband and I have a homestead half a day's ride south." She reached back and touched the bundle behind her son's saddle. "Solomon Greer told me about you. I brought something." The son dismounted and unfolded the bundle from his saddle. It was a quilt, thick and heavy, its top pieced from dozens of different fabrics, in colors that had faded but not gone blues and greens, in a deep red that was still vivid against the others. It was the kind of object that represented a significant investment of time and skill and material, the kind of thing that did not come easily to anyone living the frontier life, where every piece of cloth had a previous use and every hour had a competing claim on it. The son brought it to her and held it out without looking at her directly. The slight awkwardness of a young man performing a gesture he has been instructed in and is not entirely sure he understands. She took it. She looked at Agnes Whitmore across the clearing and understood what was happening. This was not a charitable donation. This was an acknowledgement. The quilt was a statement, a formal recognition from one person who understood what it cost to survive in this country to another person who was demonstrating that capacity in a way that demanded to be seen. She went inside and came back with a carved bird. It was the second finest thing she had made in the long winter evenings. She had been carving through those months, beginning with simple practice pieces and working upward in ambition as her skill improved. And this one, a bluebird done in soft pine. Its wing feathers suggested, with the same economy of line, that Edmund had used its posture, conveying the specific alertness of a living bird on the edge of flight, was something she was genuinely proud of. It was not Edmund's level, but it was good. It was recognizably good, the kind of object that a person with any feeling for craft would know was not accidental. She held it out to Agnes Whitmore. The older woman leaned down from her horse and took it. She turned it over in her fingers, reading it the way you read something made by hand, feeling for the quality of the work in the smoothness of the surface and the precision of the lines. Then she looked at Willa, and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears and everything to do with the recognition of something unexpected and fine. She tucked the bird into her coat pocket and rode away without saying much else. And her son rode after her, and the sound of the horses faded back into the ordinary sounds of the forest. Willa stood in the entrance of the hollow with the quilt in her arms and watched them go. The summer built around her like a house. Solomon came every 3 weeks or so, reliable as weather but more welcome. He left provisions, sometimes took cured pelts, brought information about the territory that was more useful to her than any newspaper could have been. He was not a man given to extended conversation, but he was a man who said what he meant when he said anything, and over the months of their acquaintance she had come to value this absolutely. He never talked down to her. He never performed patience or managed his tone. He spoke to her the way he would have spoken to any person whose competence he respected, which was the way Edmund had always spoken to her, and which she understood now to be the highest form of respect available to her in the world she occupied. Through Solomon, she learned more about the wider community of people who lived in the deep country beyond Harrow's Bend. Trappers and homesteaders, and the occasional solitary figure who had come to the wilderness for reasons they did not explain, and whose right to those unrevealed reasons was respected without question. These were not people who required elaborate social credentials. They required only that you carry your own weight and did not cause problems for others. And in that particular economy, Willa was wealthy. The story of the girl in the oak spread the way stories spread in isolated communities slowly, by word of mouth, each telling, adding a small elaboration that was usually more revealing of the teller than of the subject. She heard versions of it secondhand through Solomon accounts of what people said about the hollow and the girl who had made it habitable. She listened to these accounts with interest, but without vanity. What mattered was not what people said about her, but what she had actually done, and she knew with precision what that was because she had done every part of it herself. Agnes came back twice more that summer, once with her husband, a weathered, quiet man named Everett, who looked at the hollow's construction with the same attentive respect that Solomon had shown and said very little except on leaving that it was solid work. The second time Agnes came alone early in the morning, and they sat outside on the great roots and drank water from the creek and talked more than Willa had talked to anyone since Edmund Walsh died. Agnes was a woman of considerable intelligence and experience who had made a life in hard country and had the particular generosity of spirit that sometimes comes to people who have survived enough difficulty to know that difficulty is not a character flaw in its victims. She asked Willa nothing about her past. She did not need to. The essential facts were legible in Willa's face and hands and manner to anyone with eyes sufficient to read them, and Agnes Whitmore had those eyes. She asked instead about the hollow, about the carving, about what Willa intended to build next, and she offered practical information about the homesteading life with the specific generosity of someone who knows that knowledge shared costs nothing and withheld serves no one. It was from Agnes that Willa learned about the ginseng growing on the north-facing slope, 2 miles from the hollow, a plant of considerable value to the traders who supplied markets further east. It was from Agnes that she learned which of the trading posts in the region were trustworthy and which were not, a distinction that mattered considerably to a person operating alone. It was from Agnes that she received the frank and practical information about how a young woman alone in the deep country needed to carry herself, what to show and what to guard, which kinds of men were safe to trade with and which to avoid entirely, and how to build a reputation that provided its own form of protection. She received all of this without either false gratitude or false modesty. She took what was useful, stored it in the same place she stored everything Edmund had given her, and continued. It was the last week of July when Garrett came. She knew it was him before she saw him clearly, which surprised her. She had not expected to recognize her brother at a distance after 9 months, had not expected her body to carry a memory of his particular way of moving that survived even this much change in her circumstances. But there was something in the set of the figure at the tree line, the particular width of the shoulders, and the way the head sat on the neck that her body knew before her mind caught up with it. She was working at the entrance to the hollow using a chisel she had fashioned from a nail she had traded for at the post to begin a more elaborate carving on the outer face of the trunk, a project she had been planning for weeks. She set the chisel down on the root beside her and stood and waited. He was thinner than she remembered. He had always been broad and solid built in the image of their father, but the months had worked on him in a way that physical labor alone could not account for. His face, which had always been uncomplicated, carrying the easy confidence of someone who had never been required to look at himself carefully, was now carrying something else. It sat in the hollows beneath his eyes and in the set of his jaw, and she recognized it because she had seen its cousin in the mirror of still water since October. It was the face of someone who has been living with something they did not know how to put down. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the hollow, at the woven and now partly planked door, at the small garden bed along the southern wall, where the onion tops showed green above the turned earth, at the smoke lifting from the upper hole, at the careful stack of split firewood, at the carving tools laid in their orderly row on the flat root. His eyes moved across all of it, the way eyes move across something that requires revision of a prior understanding. Then he looked at her. He had expected she understood to find something diminished, a child who had suffered sufficiently to forgive the people who had sent her to suffer. That was the narrative that made the journey here make sense, the rescuer arriving to find the rescued. What he was looking at instead did not fit that story at all. She waited. He walked across the clearing slowly and stopped a few feet from her. Up close, she could see the condition of his boots, mud caked the sole of the left one, beginning to separate at the toe, the evidence of many days of walking. He had not come on horseback. He had come on foot through the forest, which meant he had tracked her, which meant someone had told him, which meant Solomon. She filed this information away without comment. Garrett reached into the front of his coat and brought out something small. He held it on his palm and extended his hand toward her. The locket lay in his palm exactly as she remembered it, oval gold, the cluster of violets on the face catching the afternoon light with the particular warmth of old gold. It looked exactly as it had always looked, as if nothing had happened to it, as if it had simply been waiting in a drawer somewhere for this moment. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at her brother's face. He said, "I saw him take it." He could not meet her eyes when he said it. His gaze was fixed somewhere past her left shoulder at the trunk of the oak, at something that was easier to look at than her face. "I saw him at the trading post with Decker. I knew what he was selling. I watched it happen and I went home and I said nothing." The clearing was very quiet. He finally looked at her. His eyes were red at the edges in the way of someone who has slept badly for a sustained period. Not one bad night, but many. The accumulated evidence of a conscience that had refused to give him peace. "I've known since October," he said. "Every day since then." She said nothing. He lowered his hand. The locket rested on his palm between them. "Solomon Greer," he said. His voice was different on the name, not accusing something more complicated. "He came to the post 3 weeks ago. He found Decker. He paid for it out of his own pocket. He sent it home with a note." He paused. "Your father got the note." He didn't say anything. He put the locket in his coat, and he sat by the fire that night, and he didn't say anything. She let this settle. But Mother Garrett said she found it. She didn't know what to make of it at first. And then she read the note, and he stopped. "She was up all night." He swallowed. "She sent me to find you." Willa looked at her brother standing in the clearing of her home in the July light, thin and road-worn, and carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has traveled a long way toward a reckoning they are not sure they deserve. She looked at him with the full attention she gave everything, reading what was actually there without the overlay of what she might wish to see or what might be convenient to see. What she saw was not the comfortable, uncomplicated boy she had grown up beside. She saw a person who had made a bad choice under pressure and had been living inside that choice long enough that it had changed the shape of him. That was not nothing. The change was not nothing. The fact that he was here on foot, having tracked her through the forest, was not nothing. She said, "Come inside." He looked at the hollow's entrance with a brief, involuntary expression of disbelief that she chose not to acknowledge. He ducked through the doorway and stood inside, and she watched his face as the space revealed itself to him. The hearth with its careful chimney, the bed on its raised frame with the rabbit skin blanket folded at the foot, and the quilt from Agnes Whitmore spread over it. the carved hooks on the wall holding her tools and her spare clothing, the journal between its two stones on the shelf, the marks on the inner wall where she had counted her days, the small, precise carvings she had made in the heartwood over the winter leaves and birds, and the branching patterns of the creek covering the walls above the hearth, like a record of everything she had seen and survived and come to know. He stood in the center of the hollow and turned slowly, taking all of it in. He said finally, very quietly, "You built all of this." She said yes. He was silent for another moment. Then she went to the shelf and took down the journal and opened it to the page she had read most often, Nathaniel Cole's entry from the third month of his first winter, and she held it out to her brother. He read it slowly. She watched his face. When he finished, he looked up at her, and she read what was in his expression with the ease of someone who has been reading faces her whole life and has recently had a great deal of time to think about what she has always seen. It was never about the knife, she said. She said it quietly, the way you say something that was already true before you found the words for it. It was about finding someone to blame who had no voice loud enough to matter. Garrett looked at this page in his hands. He did not offer a counter-argument because there was none to offer. He simply stood with the truth of it and let it be what it was. He held out the locket again. She took it. She held it in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the slight warmth it had taken from her brother's hand. She looked at the violets on the face. She thought about her mother wearing this every day of her life, the way it sat against her throat, the way Edith's hand would sometimes rise to touch it when she was tired, or worried, that unconscious gesture of reassurance. She thought about what it meant to her mother, not just as an object, but as evidence. That there had been a softer world, that she had once belonged to it, that something of it could be carried forward. She thought about Nathaniel Cole writing in the same space, by the same kind of firelight. I am not the kind of man who can take without giving something back, even if what I give is given to someone I will never meet. She went to the small writing materials she kept in a folded piece of oilcloth by the journal, a stub of pencil, and a few pieces of paper she had bought at the post and used with extreme care. She smoothed a piece of paper on the flat hearthstone and sat and wrote. Garrett sat on the edge of the bed and watched her write. He did not ask what she was writing. He seemed to understand, in the way that people sometimes understand things. They have not been told that this was not the moment for questions. She wrote for a long time. She wrote about Nathaniel Cole and what she had found beneath the flagstone, about the letter in the journal, and the 2 winters he had spent in this same hollow after being sent away for something he had not done. She wrote about what it meant that the same mechanism, the same cold and convenient logic of blame, had reached across 14 years to touch her life in the same way it had touched his. She wrote about the oak, what it had given both of them, what it had been willing to be when the world had withdrawn its willingness. She wrote about Solomon Greer and what honest men do when they have the means to act on what they know. She wrote carefully, and she wrote at length, because she understood that this letter was not just a message, but a record, not just an explanation, but a gift. And gifts of substance require time and attention. When she was finished, she folded the letter and placed the locket inside the fold. She folded the paper again so that the locket was held securely between the layers. She handed it to Garrett. He took it. She said, "Tell Mother that the locket has a longer story than either of you knew. Tell her that a man named Nathaniel Cole lived in this hollow in 1831, and that he was sent here the same way I was sent here for something he didn't do. Tell her that this locket passed through the hands of Solomon Greer, who was a man of absolute honesty before it came back to her, and that what he did to return it was done without being asked and without expectation of anything in return. Tell her she can read the rest in the letter." Garrett held the folded paper carefully, as if he understood that it contained something that could break. She said, "Tell Father nothing. Tell him I said nothing. His silence is already everything he has to say." Garrett looked at her across the hollow. The afternoon light came through the upper opening in a long, slow column. In it, she could see the dust motes that were always present in the enclosed air, moving in their random, unhurried way, suspended in the beam, the way certain things are suspended in the memory, clear and still and independent of the movement around them. He said, "Will you come back?" She looked around the hollow. At the walls she had chinking sealed against the winter. At the chimney she had built stone by stone from the creek bed. At the bed and the hearth and the shelf and the carvings in the heartwood and the marks on the wall that recorded every day she had survived here. At the journal that had kept her company through the long, dark months. At the garden outside where things were growing in the turned earth because she had planted them in the expectation of being present for their harvest. She said no. He was quiet. She said, "This is my home." He sat with that for a while. She let him sit with it. She did not explain or justify because explanation and justification implied that there was a case to be made, and she did not believe there was a case to be made. She had built something real in a place where nothing existed before she arrived. She had made it habitable and then comfortable and then genuinely good. She had done it alone, with the knowledge of a dead teacher and the provisions of a dead stranger and the honesty of a trapper who had no reason to help her except that he had seen an injustice and possessed the means to address it. Going back to Harrow's Bend would not undo what had been done. It would not unsay the words her father had said at the door. It would not give her mother back the years of warmth that exhaustion had made impossible to offer. It would not return to Garrett the months he had spent sleeping badly with a bad choice in his chest. These things had already happened. They were already the shape of the past, as fixed and permanent as the heartwood walls. What she had built here was the shape of the present, and the shape of the present was something she chose. Garrett stayed the night. She gave him food and a place by the fire, and in the morning he left with the folded paper and the locket and the image of what he had seen in the hollow, which she understood would be with him for the rest of his life, in the way that certain things lodge themselves permanently in a person's understanding of what is possible. She watched him go the same way she had watched Solomon go, the same way she had watched Agnes go. And she felt the same thing she felt when anyone left the hollow's clearing, a kind of quiet belonging to the place they were leaving, a rightness about being the one who stayed. The summer deepened into the long golden days of August. She worked the ginseng slope that Agnes had told her about harvesting carefully and selectively, in the way that meant the plants would still be there next year, and traded the roots at the post for a small hand axe and a coil of good rope and a quantity of glass beads, that she had an idea about a project that was forming in her mind as a kind of decoration for the outer face of the hollow, something that would catch the light in the mornings and mark the entrance as a place of habitation and intention, rather than simply a hole in a tree. She extended her garden transplanting wild strawberry runners from the sunny slope to the cleared ground near the water, adding a border of flat creek stones to define the space and hold moisture in the soil. She built a second small shelf into the outer wall of the hollow, covered by a sloped wooden roof that she fitted and pegged with growing skill for the storage of provisions that did not require the controlled temperature of the interior. She built a bench outside on the flat surface of the largest root where she sat in the evenings when the light was good to do her carving. She had moved well past functional objects now and into something else, small animals done in various local woods. Each species she knew from the forest represented in a different grain and color: a fox in golden pine, a heron in pale birch, a bear in the dense, dark heartwood she had been collecting in scraps from the hollow's original debris. She kept the best ones and traded others at the post where they moved quickly and at prices that surprised her, until she understood that she was producing things of genuine quality and that people who lived hard lives in a hard country often wanted to own one thing that was only beautiful, one object that served no purpose except to remind them that the capacity for beauty existed in the world and had not been entirely consumed by the work of surviving in it. The autumn came back around, 1 year since she had stood at the edge of the cleared land and walked into the trees. She marked the day not with ceremony, but with attention, sitting on the bench at the entrance in the early morning and letting herself feel the full weight of the year, all that it had been, and all that it had taken, and all that it had produced. She held the carved wren in her palm, Edmund Walsh's bird, its wood dark now with a year of handling its surface, polished by her fingers to a deep, warm glow that the original pale birch would not have predicted. She set it on the bench beside her and looked at it for a long time. She thought about Edmund, who had spent years preparing something that would only be of use after he was gone, who had looked at a young girl and seen clearly enough to know what she would one day need. She thought about Nathaniel Cole, who had sat in this same spot 14 years before and decided that whoever came after him deserved a better start than he had gotten, and had packed what he had into an oilcloth bundle and buried it under a flagstone, and trusted the tree to keep it safe for the person who would come when they most needed it. She thought about Solomon Greer, who had spent his own money to retrieve a locket from a man who had no right to it, and asked for nothing in return, and explained nothing, and simply done what honesty required of a person who knew the truth and had the means to act on it. She thought about her mother, who she hoped was reading the letter, who she hoped was learning for the first time about the man named Nathaniel Cole and the hollow oak and the long, patient continuity of a certain kind of injustice and a certain kind of survival, who she hoped was holding the locket and understanding that it had traveled a long way through many kinds of darkness to come back to her, and that her daughter had been one of the hands that helped return it, not from a place of resentment or obligation, but from the understanding that some stories deserved to be told in full, that the locket had a longer history than any of them had known, and that history belonged to Edith Reed as much as the object itself. She thought about her father with the flat, unadorned honesty she had learned to apply to everything. She thought about what it was to be a man who sold his wife's only beautiful thing to pay a debt he was ashamed of, and who then sent his daughter into the cold to hide the evidence of what he had done, and who received from a stranger a piece of paper that said, "Your daughter did not steal this," and responded with silence, put the locket in his coat pocket, and sat by the fire as if nothing had been said and nothing needed saying. She thought about what kind of life a person lived inside that silence. She thought it was a hard one, the hardest kind, the kind you build for yourself out of the choices you cannot bring yourself to unmake, and she let that understanding be sufficient. She did not need anything more from him. She did not need his confession or his apology or his acknowledgement. She had the hollow oak. She had Nathaniel Cole's letter. She had the testimony of a man who had seen everything and been willing to say so. She had what she had built. It was enough, more than enough. The morning light moved across the clearing in its long, slow October way, and the oak leaves overhead, the few that had survived into this final week before the real stripping began, shook in a slight wind that smelled of the cold that was 3 or 4 weeks away. She could feel the season preparing itself, the same way she had felt it preparing last year, with the same sharpening of the air and the same quality of light that seemed both brighter and thinner than summer light. As if the approaching cold were already beginning to refine everything down toward its essential form, she was ready for it. She had a second set of snares, now better designed than the first, placed along routes she knew more intimately than she had known any road in Harrow's Bend. She had 2 full rounds of smoked meat hanging in the outer cache, and 3 crocks of preserved wild berries sealed with rendered fat, and a sack of dried fiddlehead ferns, and another of dried wild onion. She had more silver coins left than she had spent. She had Nathaniel's knife and Edmund's whittling knife and the hand axe she had traded for in August. She had Agnes Whitmore's quilt on her bed and the tools of her carving trade stored in their orderly row on the outer shelf. She realized with a quiet certainty that was entirely different from the desperate assessment she had made on her first night inside the hollow, absolutely everything she needed for another winter, and more than that, everything she needed for the winters after this one and the ones after those. She was not surviving. She was established. The distinction was not a small one. It was the difference between a person who is managing not to drown and a person who has learned to swim. She heard the sound at the tree line before she saw the source of it, a small sound, tentative. The particular quality of sound made by something small that is not sure whether it wants to be heard or not. She had become very good at identifying sounds by their specific quality and had learned to trust that identification. This one she did not recognize, and the unfamiliar sounds always required her full attention. She turned from her bench and looked toward the tree line. A child stood at the edge of the clearing, a girl perhaps 8 years old in a coat too large for her, its sleeves hanging past her wrists, its hem dragging in the leaf litter at the clearing's edge. Her dark hair was loose around her face. She had been watching from the tree line for long enough that she had decided the clearing was safe, but had not yet decided whether the person in it was. Her eyes were very wide, and they were fixed on the hollow on the door that was a real door now. Fitted on crude but functional hinges, Willa had fashioned from bent iron she had traded for at the post. On the small carved animals arranged along the outer shelf. On the glass beads strung in a line across the entrance, catching the morning light and throwing small colored reflections onto the bark of the oak. On the smoke lifting in its thin, familiar thread from the upper opening in the trunk. Willa had seen that expression before. She had worn it herself, standing at the edge of the old growth for the first time, looking at something that seemed impossible, and finding herself drawn toward it anyway by a pull she could not name and did not need to. She set down the carvings she had been working on. She stood from the bench. She walked to the center of the clearing and crouched down to the height of the child's gaze. The way you lower yourself to speak to someone who is looking up at you, to make the conversation horizontal rather than vertical, equal rather than hierarchical. This was something Edmund had done for her. She had not known at 9 years old that she was learning it. She knew now. The girl did not run. Willa held out her open hand, palm up, empty. The girl looked at the hand. She looked at Willa's face. She took 3 small steps forward, which brought her to the edge of the clearing but not fully into it. Her eyes went back to the hollow, to the door and the carvings and the smoke, and in them Willa could see the particular combination of fear and wanting that she recognized from the inside, the feeling of standing at the threshold of something that might be exactly what you need and being afraid to trust that. "What is that?" the girl said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She was pointing at the hollow. "It's my home," Willa said. The girl looked at it with an expression of total and absolute wonder that Willa recognized from her own experience from the first moment she had stepped inside and seen what the hollow was and understood what it could become. She had worn that exact expression, felt it open her face from the inside like a door swinging out. "You live inside the tree," the girl said. Willa said, "The tree keeps its own." The girl considered this with the seriousness that children apply to things that matter to them, the full, unhurried weight of attention that adults often lose and spend their lives trying to recover. Willa turned back to the bench. She picked up the carved wren, Edmund Walsh's bird, the one she had carried in her pocket for years, and through 4 days of forest and across the whole length of this past year and all the things it contained. She looked at it for a moment in her palm, feeling the familiar shape of it, the smooth warmth of the wood that her hands had polished to a depth of color the original birch had never possessed. The small, precise eye that looked out at the world with the permanent, untroubled attention of a bird that has never had reason to doubt its ability to fly. Then she walked to the edge of the clearing and crouched down again in front of the girl who had watched her approach without retreating, which was its own kind of courage, the courage of someone who is afraid and decides that what they might find is worth the fear. She held out the wren. The girl looked at it. She reached out one small hand very carefully and took it. She turned it over in her fingers the way Agnes Whitmore had turned over the bluebird, the instinctive, careful examination of a person who recognizes that something has been made with real intention and deserves to be received with equivalent attention. Her face opened in a way that Willa remembered from inside, the way a face opens when it receives something it has needed without knowing it was needed, the particular quality of that gift, which could not have been asked for because the need was not yet conscious. "An old man made that," Willa said. "He gave it to me when I was younger than you are now. He taught me to see the forest." She paused. She looked at the girl's face, and then at the hollow behind them, and then at the forest surrounding them, all the great old trees standing in the October light, their bare branches beginning to show against the sky with the sharp clarity of things reduced to their essential structure. And sometimes, she said, the forest gives back more than was taken. The girl closed her fingers around the bird. She did not leave immediately. She stood in the light at the edge of the clearing for a while longer, looking at the hollow, and Willa stood beside her, and they were both quiet, which was the right thing to be. Eventually, the girl turned and went back through the trees, moving carefully through the undergrowth, and Willa watched her go until she was gone. Then she stood alone in the clearing of her home and looked at the ancient oak. It had kept Nathaniel Cole through 2 winters, and sent him back to the world with the understanding that survival was not the same as defeat, that a person forced to the margins of the known world might find in that marginal place something the center could not have given them. It had kept her through one winter and was preparing to keep her through another, and in the keeping had given her not just the practical means of existence, but the most important knowledge available to any person. The knowledge of what she was capable of, arrived at not through someone else's assessment, but through her own sustained, unwitnessed effort. She looked at the door on its iron hinges, which she had hung herself. She looked at the garden bed along the southern wall, where the last of the autumn onions still stood, their tops brown now, but the bulbs beneath the soil sound and full. She looked at the carved shelf along the outer wall, where the animals she had made stood in their row, the fox and the heron and the bear, and a dozen others, each one slightly better than the one before it. The record of a year of evenings spent in useful and pleasurable work. She looked at all of it the way Edmund had taught her to look at things that mattered. Not what it was, what it already knew itself to be. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers found nothing but the smooth-worn fabric. The wren was gone. She had given it away. She stood with that for a moment, her hand closed around the absence where it had been, and she felt not loss, but something else, a kind of completion, the satisfaction of a thing that has served its full purpose. Edmund had carried the knowledge of this place for years before giving it to her in the form of a bird with a secret base. She had carried the bird through everything the year had required of her. And now the bird had passed to a child standing at the tree line with wide eyes and an open hand. And wherever the bird went next, whatever it came to mean to the person who held it, the chain of provision that had begun with Edmund Walsh and passed through Nathaniel Cole and continued to her would extend further still into futures none of them could see. That was how it worked. That was how the good things persisted, not through institutions or monuments or official records, but through the quiet, deliberate choices of people who understood that what they had been given was not entirely their own, that it carried an obligation to be passed forward. She turned and went inside to tend the fire which had burned low while she sat outside. She added wood in the careful increments she had learned over the winter, building the flame back up slowly the way you build anything that matters, with patience, with attention, without rushing the process. The hollow filled with warmth. Outside, the October light moved across the clearing in its long, unhurried way, and the oak stood in it as it had stood in every light for 2 centuries, its roots deep past the reach of any storm, its heartwood dense and dry and permanent, its hollow a space that had been made by time and loss, and the slow, circular patience of something that had decided long ago to outlast everything that tried to diminish it. She had been sent here with nothing. She had found more than she could have asked for, which is the nature of the right place discovered at the right time by a person willing to recognize it for what it is. She had found a door, and she had opened it, and she had stayed. The tree had kept her, and the fire tended carefully through the night would keep her still.